If you can finish even 5 of these books, you'll think more clearly than 99% of people. And yes, I mean that literally. These aren't just difficult books, they're designed to reshape your mind. Research shows they strengthen neural connections and increase brain density, giving you the ability to think, understand, and innovate like most people never will. In this video, I'll share 15 of these books that I've discovered throughout my years as both a published academic and an entrepreneur. Starting with the first book, Bayesian Statistics the Fun Way by Will Kurt. You might be wondering why a book on statistics is on this list, and the reason is simple. I'm dividing this list into 5 categories of what is called first principles thinking. And these categories are 1. Probability, 2. Truth and meaning, 3. Logic and mathematics, 4. Consciousness, and 5. Value. If we think of literally anything that exists in our entire reality, from business, marketing, and sales, to more mundane things such as what we're going to eat for breakfast or how we're going to organize our schedule, all of these aspects of our reality are in some way made up of these 5 building blocks, just as a house is made of stone or bricks and would fall apart without them. And so what's called Bayesian statistics or Bayesian reasoning is, in this first category of books we'll discuss, probability. You see, if you want to make better choices and learn how to make better decisions based not only on gut intuitions, which are definitely sometimes important, understanding Bayesian reasoning is key. In fact, Bayesian reasoning can help guide those gut intuitions and make them more accurate. Fortunately, even though Bayesian reasoning can be a tough topic, Kurt makes understanding it really practical, useful, and relatable. That being said, every decision we make and every belief we form is based on the concept of probability. Every time you decide whether or not to take an umbrella with you to go outside, you invoke the concept of probability. Every time you decide whether to save or invest your money, you invoke the concept of probability. Every time you make a judgment about someone's intentions toward you, you invoke the concept of probability. And so, if you want a really deep dive into this foundational concept, you should read our second book on this list, Foundations of the Theory of Probability by A.N. Kolmogorov. Probability, chance, whatever you want to call it, it underlies all empirical and scientific knowledge. But it's a concrete, objective thing, right? Actually, not really. In fact, according to the Bayesian thinking we just discussed, probability is totally subjective. Although, to be fair, Bayesian probability isn't the only school of thought. But that begs the question, if probability is truly objective, then shouldn't there be only one true school of thought? Well, Kolmogorov famously laid out the fundamental axioms of probability theory, which themselves are considered assumptions, not necessary truths. But what implications does that have for science and, in fact, for our entire reality? Do you see why digging into this material will give you a mental workout? Well, research has shown that this type of deep reading and analysis helps you think outside the box and notice connections that would simply fly past most people. But this category of books on probability wouldn't be complete without our last 2 books on this list, The Scientific Image by Fraassen, I always mess up his name, and An Introduction to the Philosophy of Science by Kent W. Staley. Yes, there is such a thing as philosophy of science. In fact, I consider science itself to be a branch of philosophy. That is, the scientific method is a robust approach to gaining knowledge through the creation of hypotheses and models, leading ultimately to theories and laws. But there is a legitimate question of whether science gives us truths about the world or whether it simply instead gives us explanations and predictions about it. The latter viewpoint, which I adopt, is called scientific anti-realism, and it's the position Fraassen argues for in his book. And don't get me wrong, this isn't an anti-science position. It's simply a position that recognizes certain limits of what kinds of knowledge science can give us. But if you disagree, you'll find plenty of company in Staley's book, which contains many articles by many philosophers on this subject, and which addresses many of the questions, for instance, concerning what probability is, what scientific truth is, and so on. But then that also begs the question, what exactly is truth in the first place? Well, this brings us to the next category of books on our list, truth and meaning. Our first book we'll discuss here is yet another useful anthology, The Philosophy of Language by Aloysius Martinek. And you can see it's pretty beat up. And one of my favorite articles in the book is The Semantic Conception of Truth and the Foundations of Semantics by Alfred Tarski. It's funny, you might be sitting there thinking, why are we trying to define things such as probability and truth? Yet, actually go ahead and try to define them. It's okay, I'll wait. You see, it's pretty difficult, right? Yet, don't you find that to be a bit of a problem? The idea that the most fundamental concepts that underlie everything from medicine to law to the economy to technology and so on are things we can't actually easily define and seem to simply have to assume intuitively? Well, that's where Tarski does a great job here. For the sake of time, I'm not going to outline his entire article here, but I think he does a great job defining truth, at least from the analytic school of thought within which he's thinking. That being said, it still might not be a perfect definition. Read it and let me know what you think. The last two books on this list also deal with pinning down the concepts of truth and meaning, but they do so from very different schools of thought. In his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein partially attempts to explain how words acquire their meanings and how sentences acquire truth or falsehood. And if you really think about it, it's a curious thing in and of itself. How is it that we can speak some common language and seem to intuitively understand each other? In fact, how can we even be sure that we do understand each other or that we're saying things that actually mean things to each other on a daily basis? The philosopher Edmund Husserl asks similar questions in his book Logical Investigations, but he takes a radically different approach. In his view, which is called phenomenology, meaning is something psychological, and in a very real sense, there is no real objective meaning. But what implications does that have for science? What about the implications for the nature of our reality? I'll let you read these and decide for yourself. Now, of course, you might point immediately to mathematics and logic as the foundations of reality, truth, and meaning, and many have tried doing just that. And so that brings us to our next category of books, logic and mathematics. In some very real sense, logic and mathematics are truly fundamental to everything. How do we launch rockets into space? Math. How do you judge, as has happened to me more than once, that your dog ate that bowl of food you left out on the table? Well, that judgment would be impossible without logic. But here's where things get a little trippy. In an introduction to non-classical logic by Graham Priest, you can learn about types of logic that are used in higher level reasoning but which seem to violate many of our intuitions. For instance, in classical logic, there's a rule called the law of the excluded middle, and it's fairly simple. All this law states is that something can either be the case or not be the case. For instance, in classical logic, we can say that an apple either is red or is not red, and this makes intuitive sense, as there really are only two options, right? But in what's called intuitionistic logic, apparently you can have a third option, what you might consider neutral, or neither red nor not red, which is pretty mind-bending. But can there really be such exceptions to such seemingly fundamental rules? Read it and you be the judge. Although if you haven't first read any books on classical logic, I would start there first. The other two books on this list are just as fundamental for understanding how our reality works, and those are Modern Multidimensional Calculus by Marshall Monroe and Axiomatic Set Theory by Paul Bernays. These might seem super theoretical and unapproachable, but I encourage you to challenge yourself. You see, what initially reignited my interest in these books was the explosion of artificial intelligence and machine learning tools that now pervade our everyday lives. These theories underlie all of the algorithms and behavior, not only of these systems, but of us humans as well. Do you want to understand how complex systems such as human behavior, cultures, or economies change over time? Well, then you need to understand tools such as partial derivation and matrix multiplication. Do you want to have clearer thinking and understand how to break down the ideas you and others are communicating? Surprisingly, set theory, which I don't have enough time to go into depth on here, is crucial for that. So don't be afraid to dive into these. So by this point, interestingly, it seems as though we've covered a lot of technical, logical stuff. But isn't the human element missing in all of this? Well, yes, and that's where our next category of books comes in here, consciousness. what the hell exactly is consciousness? I mean, philosophers, neuroscientists, and psychologists have been debating this forever, and still nobody has one unified theory of what consciousness is. Interestingly, the famous mathematician Roger Penrose recently gave a talk in which he posited that the mind is part of some quantum reality that doesn't operate according to classical physical laws. And he's not the first to consider this line of thinking. Whatever the answer is, we should at least try to approximate our understanding of consciousness using the tools we have in science and statistics because, once again, science used properly is extremely good at making predictions that are useful in the real world. In this case, predictions about decision making and behavior. And if you read these books, you might just understand your own behavior a lot better too. The first 3 books on this list are Computational Modeling of Cognition and Behavior by Simon Farrell and Stefan Lewandowski, Math for Deep Learning, What You Need to Know to Understand Neural Networks by Ronald T. Nuzzel, and The Neurobiology of Neural Networks by Daniel Gardner. Psychology and sociology are important fields for understanding our individual experience and our behavior as a whole. But increasingly, there's a very positive trend of understanding these phenomena through mathematical models. I won't lie, these are incredibly tough reads, but by the end of reading them, you'll have a far better understanding of human behavior than the vast majority of people. Remember that fundamental concept of probability we discussed before? Well, the last 2 books on this list help us understand how to use those fundamental assumptions of probability, those basic building blocks of our house, to build deeply predictive models, not only of how individual people behave, but what actually causes us to behave in certain ways, both individually and in groups. These 2 books are Multi-Level Structural Equation Modeling by Bruno Silva and A Course in Time Series Analysis by Daniel Pena. Okay, so these are incredibly helpful books that stretch your thinking, but there's also a bit of a problem here. Let me ask you, have you ever sat outside and watched a beautiful sunset? If so, how did it make you feel? What were the thoughts, feelings, and emotions you felt at that moment? Well, I'm sure however you experienced that sunset, you didn't see mathematical equations popping up all around you, and you didn't experience the thing itself as a mathematical or statistical model. And this simple observation is something that philosophers and scientists continue to grapple with to this day. It's the fact that, put quite simply, the model is not the same as the reality itself. In other words, no matter how well we model a phenomenon, it itself is still just the model. So then what is the thing itself? Well, for the sake of time, I'll just say that's perhaps an entire video itself on the topic of what's called phenomenology, which I briefly shared before when we discussed Husserl's book. But that leaves us with our last category of books on this list, namely books on the concept of value. To discuss that, this video would have to be a lot longer, and so if you want to see an entire 15 more books in this category, be sure to watch this next video.